battle over the tax reform plan in Washington could play out in your church, synagogue, mosque, or temple. Good morning and thank you for joining us for State of Texas. I'm Josh Hinkle. Church leaders are watching the tax debate in Washington. Part of the tax plan approved by the House would repeal the Johnson Amendment that currently bans nonprofits, including churches, from endorsing or opposing political candidates. KXAN's political reporter Phil Prazen takes an in-depth look at the debate in D.C.
The Johnson Amendment gets its name from the Texan Lyndon Baines Johnson when he was a senator in 1954. Now, a joint congressional committee on taxation estimates that churches will get $1.7 billion more than they do now if the Johnson Amendment was repealed.
Is you have pastors on their own private property in their churches that from time to time simply want to inform people about what they feel about issues that are being voted on at the ballot box or someone that's running for office.
Jonathan Sines is a lawyer with the nonprofit Texas Values. He joined a group of pastors who sent this letter to D.C. asking for a change.
Restricting the First Amendment a lot of times and shouldn't be. And so I think the effort now is just to strip this language out.
Religious groups, however, are split on the issue.
Corporate donors can give money to me to speak about fracking, and it's not accountable and therefore not limited. So, and plus it's tax deductible.
Reverend Jim Rigby at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church worries repealing the law would allow big donors to funnel money to candidates that won't be traceable to the IRS. The Supreme Court ruled money is free speech in America.
I think who loses is democracy, but I think who wins is vested corporate moneyed power.
Congress will have to decide whether to include the change if they send tax reform to President Trump's desk. Phil Prazen, KXAN News.
Many 501c3 nonprofits currently have to separate their political work into 501c4 operations. Getting rid of the Johnson Amendment could scrap the need for separation. It would also fulfill some promises made by President Trump. He pledged to roll back the legislation after meeting with evangelical leaders during his campaign, a promise he reinforced during a speech at the National Prayer Breakfast in February. Trump signed an executive order on religious liberty in May, allowing clergy members to endorse political candidates from the pulpit and restricting actions the IRS can take against churches that violate the Johnson Amendment. But the Johnson Amendment doesn't just apply to churches. Any tax-exempt nonprofit falls under its scope, including most charities and private foundations across the country. Their mission can be religious, scientific, educational, or public safety oriented. If you want to check if the charity or organization you're donating to is registered, you can find a full list on the IRS website. Nude photos leaked on the internet pushed the longest-serving member of the Texas congressional delegation to retire. Dallas area Republican Joe Barton announced he would not seek re-election. He was first elected to Congress in 1984. Barton apologized after he admitted sending lewd photos to women he had relationships with. Newspaper reports also revealed inappropriate comments in Facebook conversations Barton had with a Tea Party activist. Barton is the latest in a series of retirements in the Texas delegation. The state has 36 seats in Congress. 7 of them will be open in the 2018 elections. One of those seats is here in Central Texas. Lamar Smith announced his retirement early last month, 20 years after he was elected. Beto O'Rourke is also leaving the House, but he wants to stay on Capitol Hill. The El Paso Democrat is running for Senate against incumbent Republican Ted Cruz. For perspective, we turn to our roundtable. Lauren McGaughy is the Austin Bureau reporter for the Dallas Morning News, and Will Weiser leads the Austin Bureau of the Associated Press. Welcome.
Hi.
Thanks for having us. Congressional turnover. What kind of impact are you going to see with so many seats open?
Well, I think we were talking about this just before we went on, how many there are. 7 people now with the addition of Joe Barton. And that's just not something we've seen. As you know, in Texas, we see these people go on for 20, 30 years in the same seat. So it's going to make it a lot more interesting. And people are going to have to really consider who they're going to vote for in the primary. I think there are, what, 10, 11 days until candidates can stop filing for interest in congressional seats. And so there could be a lot more people jumping in and throwing their hat in the race. And it'll make it more fun for us to cover, I think, yeah.
Yeah. And I know that some of those positions were leadership positions. Does that make Texas any less powerful in Washington?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because they're sort of swapping seniority, which on Capitol Hill is a big deal. People have been there a long time, and they've really built up a lot of power and a lot of clout for new faces, but that might also give a chance for people in the legislature that are maybe more conservative to go up to Washington and make an already very conservative delegation even more so. The other thing that's interesting is it's a big number, but I'm not sure we're going to see a party change. It'd really take a big upset, even though we're going to have 7 races. The 2 that are Democrats are probably going to stay in Democratic hands, and the 5 Republicans are also probably going to stay in Republican hands, barring some other major scandal. Now, we saw what happened with Joe Barton, so these things can change very quickly. But so same party, new faces, and maybe a different perspective, but also you lose a lot of that seniority, which is really important.
Were you surprised that Joe Barton stepped down over those photos and some of the other things that were talked about as well?
Well, it seems like he wasn't planning to step down over the photo itself. He was pretty taking a pretty hard stance on that. But then when this exchange came out with this Republican operative up in North Texas over these Facebook messages, and then some other women started speaking out about similar interactions with him. It seemed like that was kind of what the straw that broke the camel's back. And I think it was a little bit of a surprise, but like Will said, things are changing. Like, someone might say something a few hours before, and then a few hours later, the situation is totally different. So it's just a really unpredictable time in politics right now.
With so many people speaking up about sexual harassment in their workplaces, we've seen some major repercussions in the entertainment industry and in the journalism industry also. Not so much politics yet, but I mean, this is kind of an inclination that it can hurt your career.
It certainly can. This was a little bit of a different issue with Barton because it was sort of almost adultery. There wasn't really any complaints formally of sexual harassment. Now, the woman who exchanged messages online with him, was the activist, said she felt a little bit uncomfortable and would kind of stop interacting with him when he would text things like that and send them on Facebook Messenger. But look at John Conyers in Michigan. There have been some in Congress, and I perhaps it's cynical, but I tend to think that for every one of these cases that come out, there are many more that are potentially out there, and it's a question of whether or not people will come forward and make complaints, and it is going to have an impact on Congress and maybe even elsewhere in politics as well.
Yeah, and what we've seen is obviously in the business world, with journalism or business people, those companies have to make sometimes, really quick decisions about what is good for their brand. But when we're talking about an elected official, there are completely different steps you have to go through to determine what happens to that person. So, even with Nancy Pelosi coming out and asking for John Conyers to step down, she doesn't have the power to force him to do that. And so things might move a little bit more slowly, I think, on the political side. But, we already know we're going to see investigations, or they're ongoing into Franken. And if other allegations come out, it might take a little longer. But I think we are going to see effects. It just may be down the road a little bit.
Does this signal a greater shift in the culture? I mean, just this week, the Texas legislature was talking about how it's going to handle sexual harassment claims in the future.
I think it has. I mean, I think that every day the story continues to go on, and there are more and more very, very powerful men who have things in their past that are really problematic, and they're paying a quick price for it at the very top of media and lots of power circles, and of course in Hollywood. Going forward, the question is going to be, Al Franken hasn't stepped down. Joe Barton originally didn't want to step down. Conyers says he's not going to step down. So it's an embarrassment for people in power. It hasn't necessarily cost them an election. Look at President Donald Trump with the Access Hollywood tape that came out. But it's certainly being talked about, and the next step is, will it have electoral consequences or not?
We talked about the possibility of party changes or not in Congress, but here on the state level, we've got an election coming up, and a lot of people are talking about, where are the Democrats? Where are the people that are going to run for governor and everything? Without, a top name in there, what does it say for the rest of them? We had this rising star, but then she was like, I'm going to run, and then it's like, maybe not, so what happens now?
Well, I wrote about this several months ago and made a lot of the people in the Texas Democratic Party mad that this is a major state, and even though Democrats have not won a statewide office since 1994, which is the longest political losing streak in the nation, it's unusual that a state this large would not have at least a gubernatorial candidate. Now, they probably will. Lupe Valdez, who you're talking about, the Dallas sheriff, there was indications, she hasn't actually done it yet, but that she might step down and run for governor, and that might still happen. There are a couple of other candidates. None of them are very well known, and I think that speaks to the fact that Greg Abbott is very well funded. He's pretty popular, and he'd be really hard to beat. Now, Democrats will say that down ballot, they've got other strong candidates. They've got Beto O'Rourke, who's one of our openings in Congress, who's running against Ted Cruz. There are a couple of other races that they're excited about. But if you got a, nothing or not very well-known candidate up at the top of that ticket, it makes it very, very difficult.
Yeah.
I think with Sheriff Valdez, what the Democratic Party is hoping, if she does end up running, is that she will embolden people to come out to the polls, and that will help down ballot candidates. So if she was, in some ways responsible, or people point to her for turning Dallas County Democratic, this was 12 years ago, 12 years ago, and kind of shifting that, bringing Hispanics out to the polls. And so I think they're hoping if she does run that she probably doesn't have a great chance of winning, if she has any chance, but that the numbers that she might bring, Democrats that she might bring out to vote, will help, the Beto O'Rourke's of the world. Now that is all predicated on whether she does decide to run. There was some disagreement yesterday. Apparently a local party official said that she was running and that she was going to resign, or that she had resigned, and then she said, no, I haven't done that, I haven't made a decision. So that's still a question mark, but there has to be someone there, right? There has to be a body to run against if you're going to have any kind of impact at all, and it's just not something we're really seeing a lot of push from the party on yet.
I think it's really interesting too, because it's a debate that I think both sides want to have, right? That Lupe Valdez has clashed with the Governor Abbott over sanctuary cities and immigration policy in the past, and the Democrats see her as a candidate that can talk about that issue and really energize people that might not have turned out to support her. On the other side, I think Greg Abbott sees that as a real winner for him too. He sees himself as a law and order governor. He thinks that this is a state that wants crackdowns on immigration, wants hardline policy, and I think he'd like to talk about it as well. So that makes for an interesting race, even if it's potentially not a very close one, if it actually happens.
Rex Tillerson, we're hearing rumors that he may not be the Secretary of State for much longer. What does that say? I think a lot of Texans were excited when, we had two cabinet members, Rick Perry and Rex Tillerson, from Texas. Does that change anything for the way Texas is viewed in the presidential administration, or is it just kind of next guy?
Well, and the real insult to injury, right? There may be another Oklahoman bubbling up after we already had. So I don't know. There's going to be a lot of anger about that. But no, I mean, I do think you're right. I think people were excited, especially in a position of power with Tillerson. But that said, this is a non-traditional administration, and I don't think anybody expected Tillerson to stay in power for the whole time. I mean, these jobs are very stressful. There's a lot of turnover, and Texas could always have another cabinet member or influence the Trump administration in another way. Certainly, the politics of the White House now are much more simpatico with Texas delegation in Congress and leaders here than it was 8 years under Obama. So I don't think we're going to see a sort of a down. A loss in the Texas influence, and I don't think that even people like us are going to sweat that too much, probably looking at it.
And it seems like a lot of people in Washington like Rick Perry, so he might be staying for a while.
Well, he's the bigger personality, he's more noticeable when he walks into a room, and he's also someone that, while Rex Tillerson had the Texas mark, the Texas brand on him, people know Rick Perry. They didn't necessarily know who Rex Tillerson was before he took that position. And frankly, in Washington circles, they were expecting the Tillerson news to come for a while. The fact that there's already someone potentially in place to replace him, and someone to replace his successor, is a sign that, while this might be a disappointment for Texans, it's something that they've kind of expected. Although it hasn't happened yet, still, so we don't know. He could stay in that position.
Right.
So.
But we can confirm that Rick Perry is very cowboy.
Yes.
No matter what happens.
All right. Thank you guys very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Governor Abbott touts new progress in hurricane recovery efforts in Texas, but find out why it might get a little harder to bring more relief funding to the state. First, changing the culture at the Capitol, how lawmakers are finding ways to report and prevent sexual harassment under the dome. A committee of lawmakers met Friday to develop new policies to report and prevent sexual harassment in the state capitol. This comes after several reports describe an environment where young staffers are harassed and even assaulted at the hands of male lawmakers. Steffi Lee has a closer look.
It's everywhere at the moment.
We've seen the headlines here, and others say it's also spreading overseas. Texas State Capitol visitor Melanie Gold is from Western Australia.
The Me Too movement has been really big.
But we're going to continue to work on it.
A movement resonating with Texas House lawmakers.
Over the 9 years that I've chaired House administration, there have been a few complaints.
The revised policies define sexual harassment as an unwelcome sexual advance, request for a sexual favor, or any other conduct of a sexual nature. They've also outlined an internal complaint and investigation process.
Personalities are different and need to be handled that way. It's one of the reasons I've always had a female on my staff in case a female is uncomfortable coming to me.
If an employee or intern is accused of violating this policy, the complaint goes through the House Payroll and Personnel Department. If it's a lawmaker, the House Administration Committee chair will investigate. The vice chair will handle any sexual harassment complaints against the chair. Employees can be fired or disciplined, but lawmakers have to be disciplined by the full House and could be expelled with a 2/3 vote. The policy also protects people from retaliation.
You know, the fact that this is even coming up at all and that there are concerns that have been expressed would say to me, yes, we have an issue that needs to be addressed.
Members, employees, and interns will have to complete a sexual harassment training program by the end of next January and every 2 years after. Records of who finishes training will be public information.
Representative Guerin says House Speaker Joe Straus will be appointing a work group to further discuss sexual harassment policies during the interim. For State of Texas, I'm Steffi Lee.
Hurricane relief efforts face a growing challenge, this time from Washington. Why it could soon get more difficult to find the funds to rebuild in Texas after Hurricane Harvey. Hurricane relief efforts in Texas got a boost this week from a private business. Governor Greg Abbott joined officials from Kubota Tractor Tuesday in Fulton. That's one of the areas hit hardest by Hurricane Harvey's winds. The governor said the recovery is making progress.
But now in my 7th or 8th or so time that I have returned since the storm, driving in here today, I got to tell you, things are looking better today in Fulton, Texas, than I've seen ever since this hurricane came across the shore.
The governor announced Kubota donated $1 million in funds and equipment to help with cleanup efforts. Abbott also said the state received $5 billion from HUD over the Thanksgiving holiday. But it could get more difficult to pull in more relief funding from the federal government. FEMA's director went before a House subcommittee on Thursday asking for $23 billion in additional funds. Brock Long told House members that finding housing for disaster victims is the biggest challenge facing the agency.
Housing is tremendously different, not just from Texas, but the California wildfires, which is one of the most disturbing events I've ever been a part of in my career based on the urban nature of those wildland fires. The housing mission is tremendously different there because there's nothing to rebuild. It's been burned completely down versus where we have to go into Harvey and we have to understand what can be rebuilt versus where we need to bring in manufactured homes or how we transition people out of hotels to other options. You know, rent them if you got them, apartments that may be available.
Congress has already appropriated almost $100 billion this fall to supplement disaster recovery. The clock is running out on funding for CPRIT, the state's Cancer Prevention and Research Institute. Now, health and business leaders are meeting to talk about the future of the program. CPRIT is the second largest funder of cancer research behind the National Institutes of Health. Lawmakers have argued about whether to put more state dollars towards CPRIT or to let the organization find a self-sufficient way to fund itself. Supporters worry that cutting-edge research could take a hit when the state money runs out. At a forum in Austin last week, doctors talked about the strengths and weaknesses of the program to keep Texas a leader in cancer research.
childhood cancer, for example, which has been traditionally underfunded by national funding agencies, CPRIT supports 11% of its portfolio towards childhood cancers, compared to 4% for the National Cancer Institute. These are unique opportunities that are being provided for the people of Texas.
CPRIT has doled out nearly 2/3 of its $3 billion commitment. Just this week, the Institute awarded 3 grants totaling more than $10 million to doctors fighting cancer. This forum in Austin was the first of 3. Others are scheduled next week in Arlington and Houston.
This is a painful moment for me.
A show of sportsmanship in our nation's capital, how a senator from California settled a bet with her counterpart from Texas. Senators from Texas and California put aside partisan differences to settle a bet after the Houston Astros beat the Los Angeles Dodgers last month to win the World Series.
This is a painful moment for me.
I just saw your tweet.
Here I am. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I brought you gifts from California.
Fabulous.
Here.
Before the World Series, Texas Senator Ted Cruz and California Senator Kamala Harris placed their bets. Since the Astros won, Harris gave him 2 bottles of California wine and a box of candy made there, all while wearing an Astros jersey and a hat. The Astros win also brought a prize to Governor Greg Abbott. He and California Governor Jerry Brown also placed a bet on the World Series. Governor Abbott's office tells us he received 2 bottles of wine, but has not yet personally enjoyed them. If the Dodgers had won, Governor Abbott would have sent Brown a 6-pack of Texas beer and some barbecue. Thank you for joining us for State of Texas. Stay tuned for Meet the Press coming up at 9. I'm Josh Hinkle. Have a great day.